rule of kings and queens by asserting that all men should be ruled by natural laws, and that sovereignty was derived from the will of those governed. Locke went on to assert that the government have a responsibility to rebel against a government that fails to protect the natural rights of liberty, life, and property. So that's all really to do with the Enlightenment. John Adams was the second president, first vice president. He lobbied for declaring independence of the Continental Congress. He was a big believer in Enlightenment ideals. He signed the Alien and Sedition Act, however, and built up armed forces during the Quasi-War, which we will talk about. Another big, two big, really, Enlightenment ideals were the separation of powers, pretty much saying that the government's power should be divided into multiple branches that check and balance each other, and the direct democracy. And a good thing to not confuse is the separation of power and checks and balances. Separation of power is pretty much saying the government is doing different things, but checks and balances is pretty much saying one side of the government will always have an opportunity to check, in the U.S.'s case, the other two, to keep them in control or balance them out. Direct democracy is a form of democracy in which people can directly vote on matters of policy, not the United States, especially in the early days. All right, let's talk about the Articles of Confederation now. The first Constitution of the U.S. drafted alongside the Declaration of Independence, but by a separate committee. It strongly favored states' rights and forbid Congress from levying taxes, so kind of making them a little useless. It was ratified in 1781 and replaced the Constitution by the Constitution following Shays' Rebellion. And a key thing to know here is if you ever hear the word supermajority, it's a majority greater than 1/2, which is 2/3. So 66% of people, not 50. A key thing to know here is the Northwest Ordinance of 1785 and the Land Ordinance of 1785. It was a rare triumph under the Articles of Confederation. It established guidelines for attaining statehood. Territories with at least 60,000 people could apply for statehood. If accepted by Congress, the new state would have equal status with other states that banned slavery north of the Ohio River and east of Mississippi, therefore guaranteeing future free states in the Midwest. So that was a good thing, Northwest Ordinance was. But the Land Ordinance of 1785 established the basis for a public land survey system whereby settlers could purchase the land in the undeveloped West. This is how they could do it. It required new townships to set aside a parcel of land reserved for public education. That's nice. At this time, Congress did not have a power to raise revenue via taxes, so this ordinance created a local mechanism for funding public education. So that was a pretty big deal there. Daniel Shays was the Massachusetts farmer and Revolutionary War veteran who led a short-lived populist uprising that demanded tax and debt relief. He was pardoned in 1788, and this insurrection led over oppressive taxes and debt collectors by Daniel Shays helped spur the Constitutional Convention, which we're going to talk a lot about right now, starting with some of the main characters, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. He was a founding father from Virginia. Madison was known as the father of the Constitution for his role in drafting it and the Bill of Rights. He contributed immensely to the Federalist Papers and co-founded the Democratic Republican Party. So he wrote pretty much the Constitution and the Bill of Rights as well, and laid out really the groundwork for what was going on. It was debated a lot, but he came up with the plan, so they were pretty much all playing off of his rules. Another big character in this was Alexander Hamilton, the founding father and co-author of the Federalist Papers. As the first Treasury Secretary, helped to set out and repair the nation's credit and overall financial health. He favored a strong executive, strong military, and political centralization. This all led to really kind of a Constitutional Convention. It was a meeting that took place in Philadelphia from May 25th to September 17th, 1787. Ostensibly called to amend the Articles of Confederation, the majority of delegates arrived with the intention to simply just draft a new constitution, which they kind of got away with doing, even though they weren't really supposed to. And obviously that is the one that is still in use today. Robert Morris helped draft it, and he's the noted financier of the American Revolution. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He declined to become the first Treasury Secretary and instead recommended Alexander Hamilton. Charles Pinckney He was a South Carolinian, notable for his role at the Constitutional Convention, where he helped introduce the Fugitive Slave Clause and the No Religious Test Clause for public officers. It's, one of those things, a little bit better than the other there. The religious test really establishing America as a secular country at its founding. The Fugitive Slave Clause, maybe not so much, not very good. Later negotiated Pinckney's treaty with Spain, so he was a diplomat guy used during the XYZ affair as well. George Mason is the founding father from Virginia, one of 3 delegates at the Constitutional Convention who refused to sign the final document. He objected to its lack of a Bill of Rights and wanted to immediately end the slave trade, so shout out to him. But he did support slavery himself, so that's maybe not so good. In his 1776 Virginia Declaration of Rights, he would strongly introduce the French Revolution's Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. Political parties began to form at this time, but there were political factions within a Republican government. The Founding Fathers generally warned against such factions, but parties quickly arose during Washington's first term, because it's just kind of how the way politics works, especially in a government where you're allowed to have multiple opinions. There's not one overarching ruler. The U.S. is noted for enduring the two-party system, but there are 5 recognized party systems, although a 6-party system started in the late 1960s is sometimes listed. So pretty much there's a lot of parties, but mostly there's 2. Edmund Randolph is a founding father, a Virginian who became the first Attorney General and second Secretary of State. He proposed the Virginia Plan at the Constitutional Convention, which is a plan that called for representation in both legislative houses to be solely based on population, which is very good for him because he is from one of the biggest states. And he really hated that. William Patterson, a New Jersey, much smaller statesman who put forth the New Jersey Plan, which called for equal representation in the legislative branch regardless of the number of citizens of a state in one legislative body. The structure would be similar to that under the Articles of Confederation. Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed the Connecticut Compromise, which provided the basis for the structure of the legislative branch of today. What he said, it pretty much was that one branch of the legislature would be based on state population, and the other branch would have equal representation for all states, with each state having 1 vote. So today, the Senate is the one based on having equal votes for all states, and one the House of Representatives is based on population. So Roger Sherman put that forward. Pretty much the way of how this is pretty much how it works today. So House of Representatives is the lower chamber of the United States Congress, and the Senate, we already just talked about that. Its size varied over the decades, but was fixed at the current membership of 435 seats, in the Reapportionment Act of 1929. So that's 435 seats is the maximum you can have right now. In the House of Representatives, the Senate obviously has 100 members, 2 for each state as it currently stands. The Electoral College was a compromise of the Constitutional Convention regarding how to elect the president. Electors cast their votes as representatives of their states, which delegates believed would protect the election process from corruption and the influence of factions or political parties. But that was not the only compromise made. The 3/5 compromise was a compromise made at the Constitutional Convention, ensuring that enslaved persons in the South counted as 3/5 of a person. In addition, the South conceded to the end of the legal importation of slaves in 1808, so a small step in the right direction. So right now, the ratification began, and the process of ratification can only be done when 9 states had to require the new constitution, infringement on state sovereignty for the anti-federalists, but still things just kind of had to go. So 9 states was what it required to, or 2/3 is what it required to ratify the Constitution. The Federalists supported an orderly, efficient, centralized government. We already talked about this. Federalists pretty much are Hamilton that we talked about earlier. We laid out the positions of Hamilton, and they're the Federalists. Jefferson would be the leader of the pretty much anti-Federalists at this period of time. John Marshall is a founding father and the 4th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. We need to know about him as he cemented the concept of judicial review, making the judicial branch co-equal to the executive and legislative. A Federalist, his rulings reinforced the supremacy of federal law. So, such as in cases such as Marbury versus Madison. So, two terms there. Judicial review is pretty much that the Supreme Court, can determine whether something is constitutional or not. That's pretty much all it is there. Marbury versus Madison was the first case the Supreme Court ever decided, and that is what established the principle of judicial review and strengthening the federal government. The Bill of Rights was the umbrella term for the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, explicitly listing protection for individual rights and state sovereignty, created to secure the support of the Anti-Federalists in ratifying the U.S. Constitution, which initially had no such guarantees. These 10 Bill of Rights were added right away. Some of the major things in there: Second Amendment, right to bear arms in the First Amendment, the rights to freedom of speech, the press, assembly, all that stuff. So John Jay was a founding father from New York, John Jay High School, president of the Second Continental Congress, and the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was an early leader in the Federalist Party and contributed to the Federalist Papers. So those were a collection of letters written in the 1780s urging ratification of the Constitution. Those included, his fellows in writing that included James Madison and John Jay. All right, folks, we are almost done here. Hang on. Henry Knox was the first Secretary of War in George Washington's cabinet. The Judiciary Act of 1789 established the structure of the judiciary branch, with the Supreme Court consisting of one presiding Chief Justice and 5 associate justices. It also provided the establishment of 13 district courts and 3 circuit court of appeals, pretty much setting up the judicial system as we know it today. We already talked about Marbury versus Madison. And the Tariff Act of 1789 was a new tariff on imports. Northerners favored a higher rate to protect their manufacturing industry from foreign encroachment, while Southern farmers wanted a lower rate to provide cheaper consumer goods. So it was a pretty controversial issue over taxes. And the Whiskey Rebellion was also about taxes and was a big test to see if things would go like the Shays Rebellion or America would actually be able to put down the hammer this time. They were able to put down the hammer. Farmers of western Pennsylvania rebelled over being taxed by a government that seemingly did not represent them. Quickly defeated, it proved that new central government could stop rebellious uprisings and maintain peace under this new constitution. The Bank of the United States was also formed around this time as a natural bank in which the federal government held the major financial interest. The National Treasury would keep its deposits in the bank, keeping the funds safe and available as loanable funds. The brainchild of Alexander Hamilton was opposed by Thomas Jefferson on constitutional grounds, but that was eventually able to pass because it was something that was necessary at the time of the Constitution. And really the thing was, these guys really had the first opportunity to flesh out the Constitution, providing precedents that really stand to this day and are big principles of how our government is run today. So, yeah, the Democratic Republicans were the Jefferson team, Team Jefferson pretty much, founded by the Anti-Federalists and were for agrarian or agricultural interests. It was a political party that championed states' rights and the viewpoint of the common man. Later, Spencer would become the modern Democratic Party. It would go through a lot of changes before it gets to the modern Democratic Party today. That is for sure. The French Revolution was pretty much, we know what that is. A Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793 was a declaration of neutrality in the ongoing conflicts between Britain and France resulting from the French Revolution. It was supported by Washington and Hamilton and decried by Jefferson and Madison, who wanted to have a stance on something going on and want to help our French friends who helped us in a big way during the war for our own independence. Jay's Treaty was negotiated by Chief Justice John Jay in 1794, but shaped by Mr. Alexander Hamilton. It realized several American economic goals, including the removal of British forts from the Northwest Territory. Britain also benefited as the treaty gave them most favored nation trading status to Britain and allowed them to continue anti-French maritime policy. So we still want to get that trading going with at least one of these guys. But both Democratic, Republicans, and French were angered by the treaty, which was authorized for 10 years. Pinckney's Treaty was a treaty between the U.S. and Spain, ratified in 1796, and that was to help us deal with Florida. George Washington also started the precedent of a farewell address, which every single president has continued to do to this day. It warned Americans to, among 3 things, remain neutral with regard to European affairs, avoid entangling alliances, and to refrain from the formation of political parties, which we have listened to absolutely none of today. John Adams took